Thank you for having me again. I guess I did something right the first time, so it's good to be back. Sorry I can't be in person, but happy to be calling in from DC. I have a lot to cover, so I'm going to just dive right in. I speak kind of quickly, so I'm going to try to slow it down, though we have a lot to cover, but I look forward to your questions. Towards the end, I'm going to try to save 20 minutes towards the end for a Q&A. So I'll dive right in. Thank you so much for covering a bit of my bio, but I also like to just kind of go into a little detail about my trajectory to give you a bit of context on how I ended up in this space and why it's relevant. So I actually started coding at a really young age, pre.com in the late 90s. And moved to Palo Alto at 17 with the original intent of majoring in computer science. But while I enjoyed coding, not to the extent of building operating systems. So much of my work thereafter was enterprise software development. So I worked at Microsoft for a little bit, Deloitte, TripAdvisor, all within an enterprise software and some consumer software context. Went to MIT to get my MBA, graduated in 2013, started my first venture while at MIT, it failed, but then went on to found my second venture, Blendor, which we raised a couple $1 million in venture capital. We've employed a little over 30 people. We are in the final stages of acquisition, so I can't talk about that publicly, but I'll talk a little bit about that venture and how it's relevant to social data analytics. And then more recently, I've joined the Equity Alliance, which is a fund of funds based in New York, focused on investing in diverse emerging fund managers and companies. And all sort of the common thread of all of this is really around social data, social capital, social interactions, which is something very near and dear to my heart. So just a brief overview of the company I founded. Initially was created to mitigate unconscious bias in top of funnel hiring. So we removed any indication of name, age, gender, national origins from your profile, while also providing a decision analysis for recruiters so they could see how the demographics of the talent pool changes as candidates get further and further along in the process, and thus being able to identify where there could be bias in key decision making. In 2020, we actually pivoted away from the hiring platform to focus on the score we developed that rated and ranked companies across several different metrics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This was in response to the murder of George Floyd, the Me Too movement, sort of bringing to light all of the challenges in holding companies accountable for a lot of the PR and pledges that were going into diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we published this report, State of DEI in Tech 2021, which is public, and I'll go a little bit further as kind of a capstone project, kicking off that rebranding effort. And so now the product that is being acquired is a employer branding tool where we can help candidates identify companies where they're most likely to succeed and belong based on their values and identities, and then providing companies with insights around those metrics and how they can improve. So that's Blendor. What we'll cover today is I'll start a little bit around some of the history of labor ethics and diversity within a US and Western European context, the politicization of corporate social responsibility, how CSR became ESG, the maturation of diversity, equity, inclusion, which is sort of the S in ESG. And then I'll talk a little bit about data measurement and disclosure. So let's go into a little bit of the history. So I like to break it up into the 3 industrial revolutions and the human and agricultural age that preceded it. Again, within the context of labor, ethics, and diversity. So a lot of this was established by this gentleman, Klaus Schwab, who's very well known for publishing this book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, which goes into great detail about these different phases in in our existence. So I'll start with the human age, when a lot of our labor was dependent on human capital. This is an image of a ship, an American ship, likely crossing the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas. As you can see, they're both goods and human cargo. And this was a key aspect of the US economy in its earlier years, and very much influences the way capitalism even runs today in the categories that we think about human capital, which a lot of people don't know, fun fact, started the classifications of human categories started in the 1400s with this gentleman in Portugal, where we see the first documentation of the category of Black versus white. This was during the age of European expansion. And specifically the category of Black fit very nicely within the context of justifying the transatlantic slave trade. So the history of these categories are very important to note as we go into how they're measured and why. Furthermore, Johann reinforced a lot of these theories around classifications to come up with certain categories: Mongoloid, American, European, based on skin color and skull type, again, to classify human beings through a sort of taxonomy and anthropological lens. Now, this wasn't necessarily done for a political objective, but we'll see over time, particularly in the US context, how a lot of these categories became politicized and very much influenced immigration and labor in the United States. So again, this is just a depiction of some of these early categories that evolved to create various, excuse me, hierarchies and caste systems that we still see today, and very much are sort of the underpinnings for why a lot of civil and human rights legislation have been passed and certain initiatives put in place to mitigate previous race-based laws and injustices. So let's dive into the first industrial revolution, advent of the steam engine, and how that sort of parallels a lot of immigration and civil rights related legislation in the United States during that first industrial revolution. So, one thing I hear a lot is that we're, in America, we're all immigrants, which is patently untrue. Quite a few of us are Native American and or the descendants of American slaves, and our history and work and access to land and capital in this country go a long way. And also, immigrant populations came to the United States through various points in history for different reasons. And we'll see with the Chinese Exclusion Act introduced around the Second Industrial Revolution that the United States kind of has an arduous relationship with different demographics of people, depending on what's happening in that particular time in history. So the Dillingham Commission, for example, was initiative to bring Mexican labor into the Southwest for the purposes of development. And it was a very positive relationship with labor, which is kind of counter to what we're seeing today. We also see the passage of different acts that are establishing quota systems for different East Asian populations, all the while creating more protections for labor, as we see with the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which provides us a lot of the protections that we take for granted today, like making child labor illegal and establishing the 40-hour work week. I think now we sort of take these as a given, but in a lot of ways, these rights were actively fought for throughout history, particularly in the Second Industrial Revolution, predating the Third Revolution, which we're currently in, very much marked by telecommunications, increase in bandwidth and computing power. So the 60s very much introduce a lot of the protections that we see for protected classes, women, relating to the ability to be hired, work, and be paid equitably. So the Equal Pay Act, Civil Rights Act are probably the most influential in terms of defining a lot of the rights that we and governance that we see today. And over time, we've just continued to add more and more protected classes to enable equal hiring and equal pay. And a lot of this is governed by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which to date plays the biggest role in how the United States manages diversity, social impact, et cetera. So Milton Friedman is a very well-known economist that many of you probably know, and is known for being sort of the godfather of the concept of maximizing shareholder value, which has often been cited as in direct opposition of stakeholder capitalism. But what's important to note is that this concept is not necessarily introducing the idea that companies shouldn't care about people, labor, rights, and ethics, more so that it's not the responsibility of the private sector to define what those rules are. Companies should just operate solely based on profit and leave it to legislation, elected officials, laws for defining things outside of that scope. And I'll sort of hint back to this concept as I walk through some of the evolution of ESG, because this tension still very much exists today, as we have CEOs having to make tough decisions about whether or not to respond to certain political events, also lobbying behavior, et cetera. It's becoming increasingly more important for companies, for leaders of companies to respond to socio-political issues than it may have been during Milton Friedman's day. So we'll talk a little bit about the politicization of corporate social responsibility. So the Federal Drug and the FDA was actually formed by chemists, and in the early 1900s to really respond to a lot of things gone wrong. So whether it's infant formula, hazardous substances, this is the governing body that was created for consumer protections around the products that we put out in terms of food and drug. And it's really the first time that the government stepped in to provide oversight and regulation in the name of consumer protection. Similarly, the FTC emerged in the early 1900s, and we see a lot of protections in place to ensure that the products we use have been tested and meet baselines of quality, but also to ensure that companies are not acting in anti-competitive ways. And a lot of these acts are similar to the acts coming out of Food and Drug Administration, responding to certain catastrophic events that that demand some legislation. So in a lot of ways, the United States has been relatively reactive in terms of putting measures in place, and the road is often long and rocky in terms of getting bipartisan support. And as the country is even more polarized, as we're seeing today, a lot of these things are increasingly challenging to put in place. The UK, on the other hand, has kind of been a bit more proactive and forward-thinking. This is evident in terms of their gender pay gap reporting, which the United States currently does not have a federal mandate for reporting on gender pay. It's still voluntary. But the UK a few years ago required that all companies of a certain size are required to publish statistics about their gender pay, median and mean gender pay across their organizations if they still wanted to conduct business. We also see this in things like GDPR, et cetera, just really institutionalizing a lot of these things as opposed to leaving it to the private sector to decide how, when, and where to act. Furthermore, companies are oftentimes investing a lot more in corporate lobbying. So it's estimated that $4 billion in the US will reach $4 billion in the US alone on corporate lobbying. So this is sort of a silent undercurrent in the ways in which companies are impacting legislation, but it's not easily accessible. It's not heavily reported, but happening and very influential in terms of corporate citizenship and social responsibility. One case that I like to point out is Coinbase, whose CEO a few years back in the wake of George Floyd and many other highly fraught issues, released a memo to all employees basically disallowing any discussions of politics and social causes at work. This led to 10% of Coinbase's population of employee base leaving, but quite a few CEOs and leaders lauded Coinbase for taking this stance, which, as mentioned, is very much aligned with Milton Friedman's concept that companies should only be focused on the issues that are most relevant to maximizing shareholder value. The challenge is we have a generation of job seekers and future job seekers that are increasingly demanding more information to influence their decision-making about where to work. More and more often, your place of work is a part of your personal brand. And so it's really challenging for leaders to take a stance around being apolitical, given the increasing social consciousness of a lot of the talent that we know will be entering the workforce and leading a lot of companies. So I'll dive into now how corporate social responsibility evolved into what is now popularly being discussed by investors as environmental social governance. So taking the lens away from the job seeker, employee, labor market economy and putting it on asset management, ESG is defined from Investopedia as a set of standards that companies establish and sometimes institutional investors establish, used to screen potential investments, but also, as I'll talk a little bit about later, it is being used in the form of compliance. We've seen that with the UK gender pay gap requirements, but institutional shareholder services, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, a lot of big banks and asset managers are also establishing norms and requirements for clients and portfolio companies. So this kind of covers the full scope of ESG. For the purposes of this course, I have been directed to focus on social and specifically diversity, but I wanted to provide the full scope of what investors and asset managers are evaluating to give you a sense of just how big and broad this category is. And certainly the social component is becoming increasingly more important because it is notably the hardest to measure, track, and hold companies accountable for. So, gentlemen, I mentioned earlier, Klaus Schwab really saw COVID-19 as a big opportunity for advancing some of our social capital, social impact disclosures, because it was more and more important to understand workplace safety issues, attrition, retention, supply chain ethics, and it's still yet to be seen if that is true, but there are some early indicators that this moment in history, much like what we saw in the 1960s, will lead to major shifts in what we're requiring public and private companies to collect and report as relevant to their business and sustainability. So some of you may be following the latest Davos, but 2020 was a really big year in that the Business Roundtable released a white paper, which I'll cover a little later in the presentation, and really came to a consensus about the role that large companies play in terms of climate change, human capital rights, et cetera. So this was really the first time you see some of the largest CEOs of the largest companies in the world coming together and sort of picking away at the Milton Friedman school of thought around solely focusing on maximizing shareholder value and understanding the role that companies play in terms of planet, people, and purpose. So ESG is sort of broken up into two categories. One, pre-investment, which is how investors and asset managers think about risk. So obviously, the ethical practices in your supply chain are sort of there's a clear direct link to why that information would be relevant to a company's risk profile. We're still in the early stages of mass adoption around why having, for example, a board made up of all white men is risky, though there have been a lot of studies and data that support the benefits. There hasn't been, I would say, enough academic rigor and I'd say apolitical consensus that justifies that. So a lot of the risk management from an ESG perspective is really still just looking at labor practices and reduction of lawsuits related to labor, et cetera. And then post-investment is where we get into compliance. And we have Gary Gensler in office now, who is very much leading the charge in terms of defining what companies will have to report annually, publicly traded companies will have to report annually in terms of climate and human capital management in compliance with the demands of investors. So here's just a little chart that demonstrates sort of the growth of ESG in terms of the lexicon and what people are talking about. And it's obvious that this is becoming more and more relevant. We're even seeing a backlash from states like Texas, Florida, Georgia, who are pulling out from a lot of these big banks and asset managers that have ESG initiatives. So it's a really hot topic, probably more politicized now than ever, but an exciting time to be involved because there will be quite a few innovations and regulations put in place to ensure that companies are walking the walk. So 3 categories of ESG are exclusionary. So these are funds that do not invest in things like oil or tobacco, drugs, sin crops, if you will. The other category is ESG inclusionary. So these are funds who specifically target companies that are working on clean energy, social impact, et cetera. And then the last category are impact funds, which it's sort of a combination of the two. The key differentiator is that they are double or triple bottom line. So not only are they investing in companies that prioritize the environment and social impact, but they are maintaining metrics to identify the return on investment from an impact perspective and not just a financial perspective. The leading institutions for setting standards around measuring ESG are SASB and GRI. They have a lot of overlap, but quite a bit of variability, which again highlights one of the major challenges around data collection, measurement, and analysis. But a key point to remember and take away from this talk is you have to start somewhere, even if the data isn't perfect, even though we have all of these different systems for measurement that may not map. This is very much consistent with how financial reporting evolved in the early 20th century. We had quite a bit of variability until Standard & Poor's and a lot of entities agreed upon formal ways of measurement and reporting. So it is a process. And what took 100 years for financial reporting hopefully won't take as long for social and environmental reporting, but we have to have all hands on deck. One of my favorite documents around social and environmental reporting also came out of the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2020, because they really drill in to a lot of the people and environmental metrics, how it maps to GRI and SASB, and its significance and relevance across different industries and sectors. So I highly recommend checking out that white paper if you get a chance. So ESG related asset management is on track to be a third of all asset management by 2025. And this just shows sort of a breakdown of categories based on the different facets of ESG. So as you can see, social is still very much relevant. These things change depending on the political landscape, but growing for sure over time. So one of the biggest challenges that exists without any formal way of measuring or having standards or taxonomy around these things is the woke washing, which, as I mentioned before, was the impetus for our pivot into creating what is a FICO score for corporate social responsibility. And so in our report, we actually identified that of the 240 companies, tech companies we analyzed, they made pledges worth $4.56 billion in 2020 alone. But an interesting thing we found was for Black Lives Matter pledges, companies that made a BLM pledge, of the companies that made a BLM pledge or statement, they actually had 20% fewer Black employees, which is a little counterintuitive. I think we associate a company's communication and marketing about a thing with sort of reflecting how well they're executing. But it turns out that what companies are saying and how that actually translates into performance can be very different altogether. And so we took on the task of analyzing all of the diversity reports and data that we could from public and private sources to identify what the breakdowns were in terms of representation, as well as salary across the 5 categories of race defined by the US Census, and then compare that with what you see in the lower left-hand corner with the latest EEOC US workforce data. So leveraging the benchmarks of who's currently in the workforce to assess how well companies are executing in their own workforces. So, for example, Black employees, while they make up about 13% of the US workforce, only make up about 5% of the tech workforce. So just an interesting way that we've presented the data to provide relevant context. We also make our methodology public, and a key part of this is citing our sources. And the most valuable and consistent source is actually data pulled from the SEC, which is the DEF 14A proxy statement and the annual 10K filing. And we've seen recently, as of November 2020, that the Security and Exchange Commission has amended their regulations of annual filings requiring that publicly traded companies provide some data on human capital management. Now, they weren't specific about exactly what that means, so it kind of leaves it up to interpretation for what companies should report. But we've recently done an analysis to identify what are the most common things companies are voluntarily reporting as it pertains to human capital disclosure. So the lowest hanging fruit is obviously diversity and inclusion data, and I'll tell you a little bit why that is, but less on attraction and retention efforts, recruitment efforts, and high on training and development efforts, also high on benefits, rewards, and other forms of recognition, COVID-19 response, but not so high on workplace safety measures and employee engagement. And a lot of the challenges, again, with reporting this data is there aren't any standards establishing, with the exception of diversity and inclusion data, there aren't any standards on how to measure and collect this data. And oftentimes it's not in a company's best interest to report these things unless it comes off well, right, to investors or presents some significant risk. So until there is a bit more structure in place, it will probably remain the sort of wild, wild west in terms of how companies are reporting this data. So again, the two primary entities responsible for standard reporting to date are the EEOC, and that comes in the form of a EEO-1 document, which all companies over 100 employees are required to file, showing the demographic breakdown of their workforces. And then the 10K or DEF 14A, which are what's the documents reported to the SEC for all publicly traded companies annually. So the EEO-1 form, component 1, as you can see, breaks down people by gender and race. These are the 6 racial categories, and Hispanic is actually considered an ethnicity, not a race currently, and break down by gender, and then break down by job category. So this form has not changed much since the 1960s. As you can see, it still has categories like craft workers, operatives, service workers, technicians. So it's relatively outdated. There are plans in place to make some changes, but very, very slow moving and highly politicized. But I actually just got this notification today. If any of you want to take a listen, there is some movement in establishing Latino as a race and no longer an ethnicity, which is currently the model used, because technically you can be white Latino, you can be Black Latino, et cetera, based on our existing systems, but we're working to create a separate category. And also for Middle Eastern and North Africa, MENA. So a lot of people don't know, unless you identify with this category, that MENA is technically white, according to the US Census. They've kind of just lumped all folks from these national origins into white, which causes a lot of tension and conflict for people who are from these parts of the world and don't identify as white. So a lot of updates in the works, but again, slow moving. So this is a sample of Google's, Alphabet, their EEO-1 form from 2018. This form is reported to the EEOC, as mentioned, every year. A lot of companies now have software that automatically generate this information from their HRIS, which is Human Resources Information System. And basically, again, what it tells you is of the total employees at this company, which is 67,248, the gender and race breakdown of everyone across different job categories. So according to this form, Alphabet in 2018 didn't have any Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander people in executive or senior official roles, either male nor female. But of the total 357 executive and senior official and managers, 187 were white men. And so this is the data that companies use to produce their diversity numbers, which you probably see in some news reports and diversity reports, but this is the raw data. And very few companies actually share this publicly. There have been some FOIA requests, and there's a lawsuit, I think, ongoing to require that this data be shared publicly. But as of right now, companies are not required to share this information. And even one company in particular, Palantir, pushed back, claiming that by sharing, because they had so few minorities in executive leadership, it put them at risk by sharing this data publicly, because those individuals could be poached by other firms. And somehow that justification was enough to get them out of a FOIA request. But again, politics, right? So the EEO1 Component 2 form is an attempt to replicate what the UK gender pay gap reporting has done, but it's really cumbersome, right? So it's taking another level of the EEO1 Component 1 form by breaking down all the categories and then requiring you to mark the salary bands of everyone in your company by gender and race. Now, for large companies, again, this report can be automated because they already have the HR systems in place to produce this data. But for smaller companies, they've certainly made the case for why this creates a bit of an undue burden on them to produce. But as we know, it's important. It's important to measure and track and analyze. So to date, we just get these fuzzy diversity, diversity, equity, and inclusion reports. They're buried with anecdotes and warm and fuzzy things that companies are doing, but very little data. And it's often the last page and sort of buried in all sorts of jargon, which makes it really challenging to piece through and identify how companies are performing relative to their peers and also over time. But companies like Alphabet have been really forward-thinking and transparent. Their numbers haven't moved significantly over time, but they are very much the model case of reporting and transparency. This is a sample of a UK gender pay gap report. What I like about this strategy is it not only shows you the overall mean and median in terms of gap, and this is gender-based, but it also shows you the difference at every quartile of pay. So the biggest pay gaps observed across the board, and this is in multiple countries, multiple industries, are at the top quartile, because oftentimes things are quite equal at the entry level, and that's both with pay and representation. So a lot of the work in terms of pay gap has to happen at the most senior levels, and this reporting really highlights that. I'm going to breeze through here because I only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to give you a little bit deeper dive into what the World Economic Forum's metrics and disclosures recommend. So diversity and inclusion data, as you can see, they map it to GRI, pay equality, wage levels, and risks for incidents of child forced or compulsory labor. So that encompasses all of that social impact data that they recommend companies report. Here are just some examples of the different HR software products that companies are using to track, measure, and report these things. It's becoming easier and easier to do. So companies' excuses about the burden is becoming less and less valid. We're also seeing a merger between these HR systems and these publicly facing employer branding rankings, which is not surprising given the realization, as mentioned, that younger generations are increasingly more interested in these metrics and information, but there's still a lot out there. There's the Human Rights Campaign, which focuses on LGBTQ employees, working mother. It's still very disparate, and the methodologies are not often similar, therefore yielding very different results. There's sometimes even a pay to participate model, which introduces all sorts of bias, but we're getting there. It's a start. Also, there are organizations like Fair Pay Workplace, which are attempting to do much of what we've done for food, ethically sourced coffee, chocolate, having sort of a stamp of approval for companies to demonstrate that they have a certifiably fair pay workplace. And then one of my favorites from an investor perspective is the Just 100. They analyze companies across all sorts of measures of ESG and rank and provide insights around investment opportunities for the Just 100 companies. So lastly, I'll just point out how challenging it is to collect this data, given the variability of what companies report. So corporate social responsibility reports have been out for much longer than DEI reports, and also have more consistency. Therefore, it's really challenging to understand from a human capital perspective how well companies are performing if they don't voluntarily share that data. As mentioned, given the EEO-1 form is not required. But there are alternate ways to get data, which I can talk a little bit more about in the Q&A if you guys are interested. So the key components of DEI data and disclosure are measurement, benchmarking and analysis, tracking and accountability. This is sort of an outline of what we define as we built Blend Score, the major components of being successful if you are venturing to do some sort of data collection and analysis. One of the biggest components people leave out is the reinforcement of trust, because a lot of this data is sensitive. You have to be very careful about storing personally identifiable information through encryption and very sophisticated user access management, especially in Western Europe. The US is a bit more lax, but and then data storage and collection analysis requires benchmarking. Again, we use benchmarks based on EEOC data and also comparing companies of similar industry and size. And then it's also important to report your results. The best way to get buy-in and adoption is if you are reporting in a way that is relevant and influential to end users. It's also really easy to get this data pre-employment as opposed to post-employment. So if you're thinking about creating a survey to capture some demographic data, I highly recommend you do it during the onboarding process. Some of my favorite tools to use are Typeform and Culture Amp. And again, my recommendations are just be super transparent with why you're collecting data, given we know the sensitivity around these things in terms of racial categories, LGBTQ, disability status, and design your survey in a way that optimizes for completion. So one of the things we do, for example, is while we use those 5 or 6 categories of the US Census, we dig a little deeper. So minority groups don't feel like they constantly have to check the other box, right? And that we found optimizes for completion. And like with anything, solicit feedback and iterate. So you can capture the data that's most relevant to your organization and your priorities. And lastly, communicate outcomes. And that's it. I hope this was informative.